October 25th, 1944. Dawn breaks over the Philippine Sea and the water is calm, too calm. The kind of stillness that makes experienced sailors uneasy, that makes them check the horizon one more time, squint into the gray light, and wonder what's coming. On the bridge of the USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer barely 2 years old, Commander Ernest Evans stands watching that horizon. He's been awake for 36 hours. His uniform is soaked through with sweat. The air tastes like salt and diesel fuel. And somewhere beyond that gray line, where sea meets sky, something is moving. Evans doesn't know it yet, but in the next few hours, he will make a decision that defies every principle of naval warfare, every instinct for self-preservation, every calculation of odds and firepower. He will point his ship, all 2,700 tons of her, directly at the largest battleship ever built, and he will charge. Not because he's lost his mind, not because he doesn't understand what he's facing, but because someone has to. Because behind him, American carriers are burning. Because the men on those ships are running out of time. Because that's what destroyers do. They put themselves between the threat and the fleet, even when the threat is impossible, even when survival isn't part of the equation. This is not a story about victory. It's a story about a choice. Ernest Edwin Evans was born in Pawnee, Oklahoma, in 1908. His mother was Cherokee, his father was of European descent. He grew up in an America that didn't quite know what to do with men like him, too native to be fully white, too mixed to fit neatly into any category the world had prepared. He was lean, quiet, and carried himself with a kind of watchfulness that people sometimes mistook for aloofness. It wasn't. It was calculation. Evans saw things. He processed them, and he never forgot. He joined the Navy in 1926 at 18, when Oklahoma was still a place where opportunities were limited and horizons were narrow. The Navy offered something else. It offered the sea, which doesn't care about your bloodline. It offered rank based on competence, not connections. And for a young man who grew up being told what he couldn't do, what he couldn't become, the Navy offered proof to the contrary. He started as an enlisted man. He studied, he advanced. By 1931, he'd earned his commission. By 1943, at 35, he had his own command. The USS Johnston was commissioned on October 27, 1943, in Seattle. Evans stood on her deck the first day and told his crew something they would never forget. He didn't give them speeches about glory or patriotism. He gave them a promise. He said, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way. Anyone who doesn't want to come along can get off right now." Nobody moved. They stayed because Evans didn't ask them to do anything he wouldn't do first. They stayed because when he looked at you, you believed him. And they stayed because they were young men in 1943, and the war was everywhere, and staying seemed better than wondering for the rest of your life what you'd missed. For the next year, Johnston hunted. She screened carriers in the Marshall Islands. She bombarded shore positions in the Marianas. She plowed through typhoons and fought off air attacks and learned what it meant to be a destroyer in a Pacific war that consumed ships like firewood. Evans trained his crew relentlessly. He drilled them on damage control until they could patch a hole in pitch darkness. He drilled them on gunnery until they could hit a moving target in heavy seas. And he drilled them on one thing above all else: speed. Because destroyers don't win by being tough. They win by being fast. By getting inside the enemy's decision cycle, by hitting first and moving before the counterattack arrives. By October 1944, Johnston was part of Taffy 3, a small group of escort carriers and destroyers stationed off Samar Island in the Philippines. The invasion of Leyte had begun. MacArthur had returned. And now, the Japanese Navy was throwing everything it had left at the American landing forces in one last, desperate gamble. They called it Shogo, the Victory Operation. 4 separate Japanese fleets converging on Leyte Gulf from different directions, trying to catch the Americans in a trap and destroy the invasion fleet while it was still vulnerable. Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, the big carriers, the fast battleships, had been lured north, chasing a Japanese decoy force, which left Taffy 3 alone. 6 escort carriers, smaller and slower than fleet carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts, and absolutely nothing that could stand up to what was coming from the west. Because what was coming from the west was the center force, Admiral Kurida's main striking fleet, 4 battleships, including the Yamato, 72,000 tons, 18-inch guns, the most powerful warship ever built, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, a force designed to annihilate anything in its path, and it was heading straight for Taffy 3. The first sighting came at 6:45 a.m. A pilot from one of the carriers radioed back. Enemy surface force of 4 battleships, 7 cruisers, and 11 destroyers sighted 20 miles northwest of your task group and closing at 30 knots. The radio operator on Johnston didn't believe it at first. He made the pilot repeat it. Battleships. Out here, where there weren't supposed to be any battleships, where the plan said there couldn't be any battleships because Halsey had drawn them all north. Except the plan was wrong. Evans looked at the report. He looked at his charts. He did the math in his head. 30 knots closing speed. 20 miles. That gave Taffy 3 maybe 40 minutes before the Japanese were in gun range. The escort carriers could maybe make 18 knots if they pushed everything the boilers had, which meant they couldn't outrun what was chasing them, couldn't fight it, and couldn't hide from it. The only thing between those carriers and annihilation was Johnston, and 2 other destroyers just like her, and 4 smaller destroyer escorts that were basically coastal patrol boats with torpedoes. Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3 from the carrier Fanshawe Bay, ordered the carriers to run south and make smoke. He ordered the destroyers to form a screen, and then he did the only thing he could do. He prayed, because what was about to happen shouldn't have been possible. You don't fight battleships with destroyers. You don't charge into superior force with inferior weapons. Every doctrine, every manual, every lesson learned in 100 years of naval warfare said you withdraw, you regroup, you preserve your force and wait for reinforcements. But there were no reinforcements, and there was no time to wait. Evans didn't wait for orders. At 6:50 a.m., before Sprague had even finished assessing the situation, Evans ordered Johnston to general quarters and turned directly toward the enemy fleet. Full speed, no hesitation. His executive officer stared at him. They were going the wrong direction. Everyone else was running south. Johnston was running north, straight at the Japanese. The XO started to say something. Evans cut him off. A big target is easier to hit than a small one. And we're going to give them something to shoot at that isn't a carrier. Johnston accelerated to flank speed, 35 knots. Her bow wave rose like a white wall. Black smoke poured from her stacks. Behind her, the other 2 destroyers, USS Hole and USS Heermann, followed. Behind them, the smaller destroyer escorts hesitated, then followed too. Because when someone charges into hell, you either follow them or spend the rest of your life wishing you had. The Japanese opened fire at 7 a.m. The range was still 18,000 yards, 9 miles, but they had the guns to reach that far. Yamato's 18-inch shells weighed over 3,000 pounds each. When they hit the water, they sent up geysers taller than Johnston's mast. The sound of them passing overhead was like freight trains tearing through the air. Evans kept the throttle wide open. He zigged and zagged, making Johnston as hard to hit as possible, but he never turned away. He was closing the distance, getting inside their range, because Johnston's 5-inch guns couldn't reach 9 miles. But they could reach 5 miles, and her torpedoes could reach 6. At 7:10 a.m., at a range of 10,000 yards, Johnston opened fire. Every gun she had. The 5-inchers hammered out shells in steady rhythm. The 40mm anti-aircraft guns joined in, even though they were useless at this range, because sometimes firing is better than not firing, because it reminds you you're still alive, still fighting. The Japanese cruisers started returning fire. The heavy cruiser Kumano turned to engage, and suddenly Johnston wasn't just facing battleships anymore. She was in the middle of a fleet engagement, alone, with every Japanese gun that could bear swinging toward her. Evans ordered a torpedo run. The torpedo men had been waiting for this. They'd been trained for this. But training is one thing. Reality is something else. Reality is shells exploding in the water 50 yards away, sending up columns of spray that rain down like hail. Reality is the deck shaking with near misses, the smell of cordite and burning paint, the certainty that the next salvo might be the one that ends everything. They launched all 10 torpedoes, full spread, aimed at the cruiser column led by Kumano. The torpedoes ran true. At this range, with this sea state, they were almost impossible to miss with. Johnston's fish hit Kumano in the bow. The explosion was massive, orange flame and black smoke, and the shriek of tearing metal. Kumano slewed to starboard, taking on water. Her bow caved in, her speed dropping. She was out of the fight. One heavy cruiser, crippled or sunk, in exchange for 10 torpedoes. A good trade. Except Johnston had just used up her only long-range weapons. Now it was just guns. And the Japanese were getting closer. At 7:30 a.m., the battleship Congo scored a hit. An 14-inch shell punched through Johnston's deck amidships and exploded in the engine room. The blast killed everyone in the compartment instantly. It knocked out power to half the ship. The lights went out. The ventilation stopped. Below decks, men worked in darkness and heat that climbed past 120 degrees, rerouting power lines, patching ruptured steam pipes, doing everything they could to keep Johnston moving. Because if they stopped, they died. That was the equation. Keep moving or die. Evans had been blown off his feet by the blast. When he stood up, his left hand was gone. Not wounded. Gone. Shrapnel had taken 2 fingers at the knuckle and shredded the rest of his hand into something barely recognizable. Blood poured down his arm. He wrapped it in his shirt. He didn't leave the bridge. There were morphine ampules in the first aid kit, but he didn't use them. He needed to think clearly. And morphine makes you slow, makes you fuzzy, and he couldn't afford to be fuzzy. Not now. Another shell hit at 7:35 a.m. This one punched through the aft smokestack and exploded, killing more men and knocking out another boiler. Johnston's speed dropped to 17 knots. 17 knots is good for a cargo ship. It's suicide for a destroyer in combat. You need speed to dodge, to weave, to make yourself hard to hit. At 17 knots, you're a target. You're something the enemy can track and predict and hit. But Johnston kept firing. The gun crews loaded and fired and loaded again, working the 5-inch mounts with mechanical precision even as shells exploded around them, even as fragments whined through the air, even as men fell and were dragged away and replaced by whoever was still standing. The gunnery officer called out ranges and bearings in a voice that stayed level because someone had to stay level. Someone had to be the calm center. And if it wasn't him, it would be nobody. At 7:40 a.m., Admiral Sprague ordered the destroyers to make a torpedo attack. Evans almost laughed. He'd already made his attack. He'd already spent his torpedoes. But he understood what Sprague was doing. Sprague was trying to force the Japanese to maneuver, to break their formation, to buy time. So, Evans turned Johnston back toward the enemy fleet again. No torpedoes, just guns, just the idea of an attack. Sometimes the idea is enough. The other destroyers followed. Hole and Heermann charged in, launched their torpedoes, and turned away under heavy fire. The destroyer escorts, Samuel B. Roberts, Dennis, John C. Butler, Raymond, joined the attack. These were small ships, barely bigger than minesweepers, with crews that had been in the Navy for less than a year. But they charged anyway, because that's what everyone was doing, because courage is contagious, because when you see someone else refuse to quit, it makes it harder for you to quit too. Johnston closed to 4,000 yards of the Japanese battle line, point-blank range. The range where a 5-inch gun can punch through armor. The range where missing is almost impossible. She opened fire on the heavy cruiser Haguro. Shell after shell slammed into the cruiser's superstructure. Fires broke out. The cruiser turned away, putting distance between herself and this insane American destroyer that refused to die. Johnston shifted fire to another cruiser, then another. She was surrounded now. Enemy ships on 3 sides, shells falling like rain. The water around her was a chaos of splashes and spray and smoke. At 8:20 a.m., Johnston took a hit that broke her keel. The ship shuddered. Metal screamed. The deck buckled. Evans felt it through his boots. The deep, structural failure that means a ship is dying. But Johnston didn't sink. Not yet. She kept moving. Slower now. Listing to port, trailing oil and debris, but moving. At 8:30 a.m., a heavy cruiser scored 3 hits in rapid succession. One knocked out the forward gun mount. One exploded in the crew quarters. One punched through the hull below the waterline and flooded 2 compartments. Johnston was dead in the water now. No power, no steering. Dead in the water means you're already gone. You just haven't sunk yet. Evans ordered abandon ship. The men didn't want to leave. Some of them were crying, not from fear, from rage, from the unfairness of it. They'd done everything right. They'd fought harder than anyone should have had to fight, and they were losing anyway. Evans had to shout at them, had to order them overboard. Because staying meant dying for nothing, and leaving meant maybe surviving, maybe telling the story, maybe making sure someone remembered what happened here. The crew went over the sides. Some jumped, some climbed down lines. Some were too wounded to do either and were lowered by their shipmates. The water was covered in oil. It was warm, almost hot from the engine fires, and it tasted like metals and chemicals. The men swam away from the ship, because ships create suction when they sink, and if you're too close when she goes down, she'll take you with her. Evans stayed on the bridge. He was still giving orders when Johnston rolled onto her side at 9:45 a.m. She hung there for a moment, as if she was fighting it, as if she was trying one more time to right herself. Then she slipped beneath the surface. The survivors watched her go. Some of them saluted. Most of them just stared. Because when you've lived on a ship, when you've slept and eaten and fought and bled on her, when she's been the only home you had for a year, watching her sink is like watching part of yourself disappear. Ernest Evans went down with his ship. No one knows exactly when he died. Some survivors said they saw him on the bridge as Johnston sank. Some said he'd been too badly wounded to swim. Some said he chose to stay. All anyone knows for certain is that when the survivors were picked up 2 days later by American ships, Evans wasn't among them. Of Johnston's crew of 327 men, 186 died, more than half. But Taffy 3 survived. The Japanese fleet, after 2.5 hours of the most desperate combat in naval history, turned around and withdrew. Admiral Kurita, watching his cruisers get torpedoed by destroyers, watching his formation break apart under attack from the ships that shouldn't have been attacking at all, concluded he was facing a much larger American force than intelligence had indicated. He thought the destroyers were cruisers. He thought the escort carriers were fleet carriers. And he decided that pressing the attack would result in the destruction of his own fleet. So he turned around, he sailed back through San Bernardino Strait, and the invasion of Leyte continued. The carriers that Johnston died protecting launched the aircraft that destroyed the last of Japan's carrier fleet the next day. They launched the aircraft that supported MacArthur's advance through the Philippines. They launched the aircraft that eventually helped end the war. Every mission they flew, every bomb they dropped, every pilot who came back alive, all of it owed something to the fact that on October 25, 1944, a destroyer and her crew bought them time, bought them with blood and steel, and a decision that looked insane to everyone except the man who made it. Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor in 1945. The citation reads, in part, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. In the battle off Samar, Commander Evans boldly committed his ship to action against a vastly superior enemy force, unhesitatingly joined in attacks against battleships and heavy cruisers, and by his brilliant seamanship and gallant fighting spirit, contributed materially to the success of our forces and to the survival of the escort carriers. He was the first Native American in the Navy to receive the Medal of Honor. He was 36 years old when he died. He left behind a wife and 2 children. His daughter was 3. His son was 6 months old and never knew his father except through stories. The survivors of Johnston spent 50 hours in the water before they were rescued. Some died from wounds, some from exposure, some from sharks, drawn by the blood and the thrashing. The ones who made it back carried the memory of those hours with them forever. In interviews decades later, they would still talk about it. The cold nights, the burning days, the weight of the life jackets dragging them down, the taste of oil and salt water, the voices of men calling for help and then falling silent. And they would talk about Evans, about how he'd looked at them that first day in Seattle and told them it was going to be a fighting ship, about how he'd kept his promise. The battle off Samar became known as one of the most lopsided naval battles in history, not because of who won, but because of who shouldn't have lost. On paper, Taffy 3 didn't stand a chance. The Japanese had them outgunned, outranged, and outnumbered in every category that mattered. But paper doesn't account for will. It doesn't account for men who decide that the odds don't matter as much as the mission. It doesn't account for commanders who see a battleship bearing down and decide that charging is the only answer that makes sense. Military historians still study the battle. They analyze Kurida's decision to withdraw. They debate whether he could have broken through if he'd pressed harder, whether the war might have lasted longer, whether the atomic bombs might never have been necessary if Lady Gulf had fallen. They teach it at Annapolis and the Naval War College as an example of aggressive defense, of how smaller forces can defeat larger ones through audacity and speed, and a willingness to take casualties that the enemy doesn't expect. But the men who were there don't talk about doctrine. They talk about smoke and fire and the sound of shells hitting water. They talk about friends who didn't make it, and they talk about a commander who, when faced with an impossible choice, didn't hesitate, didn't calculate the odds, didn't radio for permission, just turned his ship toward the enemy and ordered flank speed. Johnston's wreck was found in 2019, more than 4 miles beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea, deeper than any shipwreck ever discovered. The hull is broken, twisted by the impacts and the pressure, but recognizable. The bridge where Evans stood is still there, collapsed but intact. The torpedo tubes are empty, the guns are silent, and lying on the seafloor around the wreck are thousands of spent shell casings, each one a testament to men who kept firing when firing was all they had left. There are no monuments to Johnston in Washington, no grand memorials. Most Americans have never heard of the battle off Samar. They know about D-Day in Iwo Jima and Midway, but Samar remains obscure, forgotten. One of those footnotes that only military historians and old sailors remember, which seems fitting somehow. Because Johnston wasn't fighting for glory. She was fighting because someone had to. Because the carriers behind her were full of young men from farms and factories who'd never asked to be in a war but found themselves in one anyway. Because protecting them was the job, and Evans never forgot what the job was. In the years after the war, some of Johnston's survivors stayed in the Navy. Some went home and never spoke about it. Some woke up at night hearing the sound of shells exploding, feeling the deck shake, seeing faces that had been gone for years. They had families, they had careers. They lived long lives, most of them, but part of them never left Samar. Part of them was always in the water, watching Johnston sink, wondering how they survived when so many others hadn't. There's a photograph of Evans from 1943, taken shortly after Johnston was commissioned. He's standing on the bridge in his dress uniform, looking at something off camera, his face serious and calm. He looks young, though he wasn't. He looks confident, though he had every reason not to be. And if you look closely at his eyes, you can see something that photographs usually miss, the kind of determination that doesn't need words, the kind that says, I know what I signed up for, I know what it might cost, and I'm doing it anyway. That photograph is in the Naval History and Heritage Command archives in Washington. Most people walk past it without noticing, but sometimes a young officer stops and reads the plaque, reads about what Evans did, about what Johnston did, and they stand there for a long time thinking about what it means to command a ship, to be responsible for men's lives, to make decisions when all the options are bad and there's no time to think and everything depends on getting it right. And sometimes they wonder if they would have done what Evans did, if they would have charged, if they would have stayed calm when the shells started falling, if they would have kept fighting when fighting became impossible. And they wonder it because that's what the story makes you wonder. That's what heroism does. It asks questions about who we are and who we could become if we were tested the way Evans was tested. The Japanese sailors who survived the battle off Samar rarely spoke about it. In post-war interviews, when asked about Taffy 3, they would shake their heads. Some said they thought they were fighting cruisers, not destroyers. Some said the American smokescreens were too effective. Some said Admiral Kurita made a mistake, but a few, the honest ones, admitted something else. They said the ferocity of the attack had shaken them, that they'd never seen destroyers fight like that it had seemed suicidal, and that they'd started to question whether pressing forward was worth the cost. Because that's what Johnston did. She made the Japanese blink. She made them doubt. She made them look at the situation and decide that the price was too high, even when they were winning. And sometimes, in war, making the enemy doubt is enough. Sometimes, that's everything. On the deck of the Yamato, as the Japanese fleet withdrew, lookouts counted the fires. They'd sunk or crippled 2 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and a destroyer escort. They'd damaged others. By any measure, they'd won the tactical engagement. But they'd lost the strategic battle because the invasion fleet was intact, because the carriers were still launching planes, because Lady Gulf was still in American hands, and because somewhere behind them, sinking into the dark water, was a destroyer that had refused to yield. There's a concept in warfare called force multiplication. It's when a small unit performs far beyond its expected capabilities, effectively acting like a much larger force. Johnston was a force multiplier that day. She wasn't just one destroyer, she was the embodiment of an idea, that sometimes the smaller ship wins because it wants it more. That aggression can overcome firepower. That courage, real courage, the kind that stares at overwhelming odds and charges anyway, can change the course of history. The men who served with Evans understood this instinctively. They didn't need military theory. They'd lived it. They'd been on that bridge when he gave the order to attack. They'd seen his face. They'd heard the certainty in his voice. And they'd followed him because leadership isn't about rank or authority. It's about trust. It's about believing that the person giving orders has thought it through, has weighed the costs, and has decided this is the path, even when the path leads into fire. In 1975, 30 years after the war ended, the surviving crew of Johnston held a reunion. 63 men came. They were older now, gray-haired, soft around the middle, wearing civilian clothes that didn't quite fit right. They talked about their grandchildren and their jobs and the weather. And then, after dinner, someone started telling stories about the commissioning, about the shakedown cruise. About that morning off Samar when the world turned into shells and smoke and impossible choices. And they cried. Grown men, veterans, crying for friends who'd been dead for 3 decades. Crying for a ship that had been the best home they'd ever known. Crying because they were the lucky ones, and luck has a weight that never quite lifts. One of them, a former gunner's mate named Robert Billy, said something that night that got repeated often afterward. He said, "We didn't think we were heroes. We thought we were doing what had to be done. Commander Evans didn't give us a choice, not by ordering us, but by showing us. He went first. And once someone goes first, you can't not follow." That's the thing about leadership that's hard to teach. You can study it. You can read the manuals and the case studies. You can learn the principles. But knowing when to charge, knowing when the impossible thing is also the necessary thing, that's not something you learn from books. That's something you carry inside you, or you don't. Evans carried it, and on October 25, 1944, he showed everyone what it looked like. The ocean off Samar looks no different now than it did then. The water is the same blue. The sun rises and sets the same way. Fishermen work these waters, unaware they're sailing over a graveyard, and 4 miles down, in the crushing darkness where light never reaches, Johnston rests. Her steel is corroding slowly. Her paint is long gone, but she's still there, still pointing north toward where the enemy was, still in the fight, even now. Wars are won by logistics and strategy and industrial capacity, but they're also won by moments, by individual decisions that cascade into larger consequences, by men like Ernest Evans who looked at an impossible situation and decided that impossible just meant no one had tried hard enough yet, who took a small ship with a small crew and accomplished something that admirals with entire fleets couldn't have done better, who proved that size doesn't matter as much as spirit, that a destroyer crewed by men who refuse to quit can stand toe-to-toe with a battleship and make it blink. This is not a story about a ship. Ships are metal and machinery. They rust, they sink, they're replaced. This is a story about what people do when everything depends on them, and the odds are stacked so high that survival isn't even part of the equation anymore. It's about the moment when you stop calculating and start acting. When you stop being afraid of death and start being afraid of failing the people counting on you. Ernest Evans didn't change naval doctrine. He didn't invent new tactics. He didn't have secret weapons or superior technology. What he had was a clear understanding of what his ship was for. Destroyers exist to protect the fleet, to put themselves between the threat and the ships they're screening, to be the first line of defense and the last line if necessary. And when the moment came, Evans didn't complicate it. He didn't overthink it. He just did what destroyers do. He charged, and because he charged, the carriers lived. And because the carriers lived, the invasion succeeded. And because the invasion succeeded, the war moved one step closer to ending. You can't draw a straight line from Johnston's bow to Hiroshima. History doesn't work that way, but you can say with certainty that without Johnston, the battle would have gone differently. And maybe, just maybe, the war would have too. That's the legacy. Not a statue, not a monument, not a place in the history books that everyone knows. Just the quiet knowledge that, when it mattered most, when the world was reduced to shells and smoke and impossible choices, there were men who looked at the situation and decided that courage was the only answer, who understood that sometimes you don't fight because you can win. You fight because the alternative is unthinkable. The survivors are almost all gone now. The last reunion was in 2018. 12 men came. 12 men in their 90s, some in wheelchairs, some with nurses, all of them carrying the weight of a day 74 years past. They stood together and looked at photographs of a ship that most Americans have never heard of. They spoke names that no one remembers anymore, and they toasted a commander who made them believe that small ships could do big things, that destroyers could fight battleships, that courage could multiply force, that one man's decision in the gray light of an October dawn could ripple forward through decades and touch lives that would never know his name. The war ate men by the millions. It consumed ships and planes and cities. It turned the Pacific into a graveyard that stretches from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo. And in that vast ocean of loss, Johnston is just one more wreck. Evans is just one more name. But names add up, wrecks accumulate, and each one represents a moment when someone decided that duty mattered more than survival. That protecting others was worth the cost. That going down fighting was better than not fighting at all. This is not a story about victory. The battle was a draw. Johnston sank. Evans died. Most of his crew never made it home, but the carriers survived. And that survival bought time. Time for the invasion to take hold. Time for the Philippines to be liberated. Time for the war to move forward. And in the brutal arithmetic of wartime, time is everything. These are the forgotten pages of a war that consumed a generation. The stories that don't make it into textbooks. The battles fought by men whose names fit on small bronze plaques in quiet museum hallways. The moments when someone ordinary, a kid from Oklahoma, a boy who grew up being told what he couldn't become, did something extraordinary not because he was special, but because the moment demanded it and he was the one standing there when the demand came. Ernest Evans didn't set out to be a hero. He set out to be a good officer, to take care of his crew, to do the job right. And when the job turned into something impossible, he did it anyway. He pointed his ship at the enemy and charged, not because he wanted to die, but because staying alive meant letting others die instead. And that wasn't acceptable. Not to him, not on his watch. Not while Johnston still had shells in her magazines and steam in her boilers and men willing to fight. The ocean keeps its secrets. Johnston's wreck will rest there for centuries, slowly dissolving into rust and sediment. The men who served on her are nearly all gone. The war they fought has passed from living memory into history. But the lesson remains. The lesson that ordinary people, given extraordinary circumstances, can reach inside themselves and find something they didn't know was there, can stand their ground when every instinct screams to run, can fight when fighting means dying, can charge when charging seems insane, can look at a battleship 10 times their size and decide that size doesn't matter, that what matters is the men behind you, the mission in front of you, and the choice you make when the shells start falling, and there's no one left to make it but you.